Okay, let's unpack this.
Let's do it.
We have been handed, well, a really fascinating stack of sources, and they promise not just a look into technology ethics, but something deeper, something about the very nature of human self-deception.
Yeah, that's exactly it. We are tackling a philosophical essay by Vitalik Buterin, Galaxy Brain Resistance. But what's really amazing, what the sources do, is connect this very modern tech critique with, well, with thousands of years of ancient moral inquiry.
Absolutely. This isn't a simple summary of an essay. I mean, not at all. We've got the core concepts, sure, but then we have these detailed philosophical critiques that really pressure test the whole idea.
And then the theological responses.
I mean, it's profound. The sources frame this as an argument that shifts the problem from, just bad logic to a deeply ingrained moral failing.
That's right. So the mission today, I think, it's extremely robust. We're aiming to extract clear, high-resistance reasoning tools for the modern world.
Like intellectual armor.
Exactly. The intellectual armor that helps us distinguish sound, constrained logic from the seductive lure of sophisticated self-justification. The ultimate trap of being too clever.
And the stakes are just enormous. Why does the resistance of our reasoning matter now? More than ever.
It's leverage, isn't it? It's just unprecedented leverage. The danger that Vitalik identifies, this style of thinking that can justify anything, it's an ancient problem. I mean, it's as old as humanity.
Sure.
But you put it in the context of AI governance or the design of global financial infrastructure or climate policy.
Yeah.
And suddenly the problem for error just shrinks to basically zero.
Right.
Our reasoning systems, they have to resist our biases in proportion to the power those systems wield. So if your ethical framework is, infinitely malleable,
it just collapses.
it collapses under the first sign of pressure. It's useless.
So let's nail down the core concept before we jump into the traps. What exactly is galaxy brain resistance, or GBR?
At its core, it's a measure of malleability. The central question is this: how difficult is it to twist or abuse a style of thinking to justify what you already want to believe?
Or what already conveniently aligns with your incentives.
Precisely. If an argument is so flexible that it can rationalize everything from, say, founding a benevolent philanthropic foundation to running a transparently zero-sum gambling scheme,
then it justifies nothing.
it justifies nothing. It has no meaning.
It's the intellectual equivalent of scientific falsifiability, isn't it? In science, a theory has to be structured so that it can be proven wrong. If it explains every possible outcome, it's useless because it doesn't predict anything.
Yes. And Vitalik is applying that same stringent test to moral philosophy and futurism. And that's the resistance factor. We're looking for arguments, principles, frameworks that push back against our biases.
Arguments that are hard.
Arguments that require real effort and sometimes personal or financial pain to uphold. If your elaborate philosophical system conveniently leads you exactly where your financial incentives or your ego or your social tribe already wanted you to go,
then it's a low-resistance argument.
it has zero resistance. It's just rationalization dressed up in fancy language. It has no teeth because it doesn't force a sacrifice.
I love that framing. Resistance requires sacrifice. Okay, let's jump into the specifics because Vitalik identifies 6 classic patterns of this low-resistance reasoning that clever people, especially in high-leverage positions, fall into.
He does. And we need to break these down meticulously.
Let's start with number 1, the trap of inevitabilism.
This is maybe the most pervasive and insidious rationalization in frontier tech and policy today. The core argument is powerful. It's very seductive.
What is it?
It's the idea that because something, let's say, advanced AI or full automation or some new market structure, is destined to happen due to technological or economic forces,
then we're not only allowed, but maybe even morally compelled to make it happen faster.
Exactly. It gives you the perfect moral shield. You hear it constantly.
Oh, all the time. Don't judge me for making this dangerous thing because if I didn't, my competitor would have. Or historical forces demanded it. I'm just doing the hard work of destiny.
And Vitalik's critique here is just surgically sharp. He argues that this is rarely genuine philosophy. It's almost always a justification that hides very clear self-interest.
Can you give an example?
Well, think of the companies racing to be first to market with potentially risky general intelligence systems. They're accelerating their own incentives, recruiting top talent, getting the next round of funding, prestige.
Right.
And they just baptize that self-interest with the language of historical necessity. We have to do this for humanity's future.
And he also points out that this argument completely ignores agency. It treats this complex technological development like it's a force of nature, like the weather or something.
Yes, AI progress isn't a perfectly competitive market where millions of equal actors are just anonymously contributing. That's a fiction. We know that a handful of dominant labs and players are making specific, high-stakes decisions about safety, speed, and capabilities.
They have immense agency.
Immense agency, and they are responsible for how they use it. So claiming inevitability is just. It's an abdication of that responsibility. It's a way of saying, my choices don't matter.
And what's more, this inevitabilist mindset, it simplifies the ethical dilemma until it's basically meaningless.
It flattens the choice space. It reduces it to a binary. Do X or not do X. And Vitalik insists that this ignores all the crucial high-resistance options.
Which are?
Do X differently. Do X slower. Do X with specific hard constraints. Or even do X only after we develop the prerequisite safety measures.
And all of those choices involve slowing down.
Which means sacrificing short-term profits or prestige or market position. And that's why they are high resistance. They cost you something.
This is where the theological source material immediately provides this powerful, ancient counterpunch. It's amazing how directly it speaks to this.
It really is. The biblical response directly rejects this inevitabilist logic. It frames it as a cheap, secularized parody of divine providence.
It's the Apostle Paul, right, in Romans.
The Apostle Paul, writing in Romans 3:8, confronts this exact consequentialist logic. He says, why not say, as some slanderously claim that we say, let us do evil that good may result?
And his response.
It's immediate and absolute. Their condemnation is deserved. The ancient wisdom is unequivocal. Your moral agency is never canceled by some perceived inevitability.
So you can't outsource your conscience to destiny or history.
You can't. Even if some negative outcome feels fated, your moral responsibility is to pursue the righteous course in spite of that perceived fate. You're judged for your actions, not for the outcome you couldn't control.
The moment you use destiny to justify a morally questionable action, you are taking the form of divine necessity but filling it with the content of your own self-serving choice.
That's a perfect way to put it. And the accountability remains yours, regardless of the trend.
Okay, that's a powerful start. Let's move to pattern number 2. The malleability of long-termism. Now, this is a concept often associated with effective altruism and existential risk research, and Vitalik is deep in that world, so his critique carries a lot of weight.
It does. And he's careful here. He says, long-termism, the intellectual project of considering the effects of our actions over vast timescales, is fundamentally valid. I mean, it's arguably essential, but he argues that it has very low resistance as a mode of reasoning. And the reason is that the far future is vague, it's unmeasurable, and it is incredibly easy to manipulate rhetorically.
It's the ultimate canvas for fantasy projection. You can paint any picture you want on it.
Well,
What are the specific failure modes he cites?
Well, first, ethically, it allows the justification of fantasies, of speculative bubbles, and of potentially harmful present actions. He has this great phrase for them, the bridge to nowhere.
A bridge to nowhere.
Because the touted benefit is potentially centuries or millennia away, saving future generations from extinction, there's no short-term feedback loop. There's no way to prove that the present harm or cost is actually worth it.
The only evidence is the story you tell.
The only evidence is in the narrative. And if the narrative is compelling enough, you can justify almost anything in the present.
And we see this clearly in markets, right? He makes a strong connection to finance.
Absolutely. In speculative finance, you get this toxic combination of low interest rates and a grand, long-term visionary narrative. We're building the infrastructure for the next 1,000 years. And it often leads directly to asset bubbles.
Because the future gains are totally speculative.
Entirely speculative. They may never materialize, but the current financial risk and the harm to investors who get caught up in it are certain. They are happening right now.
He even points out that the phrase, "we live in unprecedented times," is often a low-resistance argument in itself.
Yes, because it's a convenient way to excuse speculation or recklessness. It lets you say, all historical wisdom and all past precedents don't apply here, because this time it's different. It's a get-out-of-jail-free card for thinking rigorously.
So if long-termism is so malleable, how does he suggest we practice a high-resistance version of it? What's the constraint?
He proposes a crucial rule that acts as a guardrail. He says we should prefer actions with proven long-term track records.
What does that look like in practice?
It means focusing on things we know how to do that yield lasting benefits. Things like promoting sustainable economic growth, strengthening democratic institutions, or preventing known existing extinctions. Concrete things.
As opposed to what?
as opposed to actions where the long-term gains are highly speculative and uncertain. But the present harms like accelerating systemic risk in the financial system or encouraging reckless financial behavior are clear and certain.
That feels like a solid constraint. It's very practical. But the critic that we have in our sources notes a necessary tension here.
There is tension.
If we are only constrained to actions with proven track records, don't we risk becoming overly conservative? What about emerging novel catastrophic risks that have no track record?
That's the nuance we have to grapple with. The critic argues that Vitalik risks painting all philosophical long-termism with the same brush of speculative narrative plus weak feedback. And that's not fair.
Because some legitimate, crucial long-term projects have no short-term payoffs.
Exactly. Think about comprehensive climate change mitigation, or building global health infrastructure to prevent the next pandemic, or, nuclear risk reduction. These have zero short-term payoffs.
But they're essential.
They're non-negotiable.
Yeah.
They're widely regarded as rational investments in our long-term resilience. So you can't just throw out the whole concept.
So the challenge isn't dismissing long-term thinking, but designing robust, epistemic guardrails?
That's the term. How do we create mechanisms for structured skepticism? How do we distinguish good long-term thinking from what's just, comforting vibes?
You'd need systems that force proponents to articulate clear, falsifiable intermediate steps, even if the final goal is hundreds of years away.
Right. If the only defense of a project is, trust me, it'll save the world in 500 years, its resistance is likely zero. There has to be something more concrete to hold on to.
This moves us neatly to pattern number 3, banning things based on aesthetics. This is where ethics meets cultural politics, and Vitalik takes a really strong stance against what he sees as moral authoritarianism.
He does. His core argument is that people often disguise personal disgust or aesthetic dislike or moral revulsion with these grand philosophical-sounding arguments.
Like what?
Things like synthetic meat is unnatural or, any number of culture war issues. They use vague, infinitely stretchable arguments like harm to the moral fabric of society.
And then those are low resistance because they can be stretched to justify literally anything the speaker dislikes.
Anything, without ever requiring the intellectual work of identifying a specific victim or a measurable harm. It's reasoning from a place of, I don't like that.
And the danger is what?
The danger is that these arguments enable authoritarian control over personal life. They create political incentives for endless culture wars based on tribal identity, rather than concrete harm that can be clearly bounded and defined.
So it's Vitalik's alternative. He calls it moderate libertarianism.
Yeah, he favors banning things only when there's a clear, identifiable, bounded harm to others. If the harm is diffuse and vague, he remains highly skeptical of state coercion.
Why?
Because that very vagueness is the perfect vehicle for rationalizing oppression. It allows the powerful to define harm to the moral fabric in a way that just so happens to target people they don't like.
But this is another point where the critique pushes back with some necessary force. Our sources acknowledge that Vitalik is right to target authoritarian aesthetics, but they stress that not all diffuse harms are fake.
And this is a crucial tension for any modern regulatory policy. This is not an easy problem. The critic provides some excellent examples of genuine diffuse harms. Consider social media platforms. You can't point to a single transaction and say, this post harmed victim A in this specific way. But you can absolutely argue that the design of the platform as a whole can corrode civic culture or fuel political polarization or degrade the attention economy.
Right, it's a systemic harm.
It's a systemic harm. Or highly processed foods. They degrade population health over decades via complex causal chains. Or environmental destruction. That's the ultimate emergent, systemic, and diffuse harm.
So if we rely only on Vitalik's principle of clear, sharply bounded harms, we risk ignoring real, slow structural damage.
That's the danger. You're left unable to even talk about genuine societal deterioration because no single transaction neatly explains it.
So the challenge then isn't just saying don't use vague concepts. It's about designing institutional and rhetorical mechanisms that can detect real diffuse harm.
Like a measurable decline in public health or civic trust.
Without letting those necessary concepts get captured and weaponized by moral authoritarians who just want control.
It's a razor's edge, a very difficult balance to strike.
And the theological parallel here is fascinating because, kind of surprisingly, Jesus sides strongly with Vitalik's core anti-authoritarian impulse, especially against purity culture.
Yes, the sources show Jesus explicitly challenging the purity laws that were being used for cultural exclusion and control, particularly those imposed by the Pharisees.
He called them out for it.
Directly. He rebuked those who imposed heavy burdens on others while neglecting the sturdy, high-resistance moral requirements: justice, mercy, and faithfulness. So the ancient wisdom validates the critique of rules that are based merely on aesthetic disgust or tribal purity.
Okay, let's move to pattern number 4, bad finance narratives and the gambling trap. This is obviously vital to the crypto ecosystem that Vitalik is trying to reform from within.
It is. The core argument here is that a lot of crypto narratives, especially things like the 10x opportunity for the poor, are just galaxy brain rationalization.
They're used to do what?
They're used to encourage incredibly risky gambling, to disguise what are inherently zero-sum or even negative-sum dynamics, and critically, to feed the incentives of influencers and initial founders who profit regardless of whether their followers win or lose.
And he doesn't just say this, he grounds this critique in basic, irrefutable economic theory.
Absolutely. The concept of concave utility. It proves that random high-volatility coin flips, 2x or 12-year money, hurt people more than they help, especially if they're already poor and can't afford the downside risk.
It's not a path to prosperity.
It's a path to ruin for most. So when this kind of speculation is dressed up as social emancipation or banking the unbanked, it becomes predatory.
So his endorsement, his solution, is focusing the ecosystem's moral core on low-risk DeFi. We should probably elaborate on that concept because the critique did mention it was a bit fuzzy. What makes something low risk and high resistance in his view?
Low-risk DeFi, for him, focuses on genuine utility. It's about tools that hedge political risk or offer predictable, stable yields. They operate primarily using stable assets and are often over-collateralized or audited to minimize catastrophic loss.
Give me a concrete example.
Using stablecoins for borderless remittances, so someone can send money to their family without losing 10% to fees and volatility, or lending protocols that are heavily over-collateralized and rely on mathematically audited smart contracts rather than on volatile governance tokens or new meme coins, which are effectively just lottery tickets.
So it's about building genuine, predictable financial infrastructure.
Not casinos disguised as social mobility projects.
And the condemnation from the theological sources here is, as you might expect, swift and absolute. It sees this through the lens of greed and oppression.
Yes, the biblical ethics warn intensely against get-rich-quick schemes, particularly those that prey on the hopes of the desperate. Proverbs 28.2 explicitly states, "One eager to get rich will not go unpunished."
So this type of financial narrative is condemned as what?
As exploiting the vulnerable and stoking covetousness. It violates the core principles of economic justice found throughout that tradition.
Okay, next up is pattern number 5, which Vitalik calls the ultimate galaxy brain argument.
Yes, power maximization.
The argument that can justify virtually anything.
This is the philosophy of give me absolute power so I can do maximum good later.
Right.
It's the lowest resistance argument possible because it can justify any amount of moral compromise, any amount of control.
And fundamentally, it's entirely indistinguishable from pure self-serving ambition.
There's no way to tell the difference from the outside, or even from the inside, often.
And the risk he cites here is something he calls value drift. We need to expand on that. How does value drift actually work in practice?
Value drift is the institutional gravity that pulls high ideals down towards institutional survival and personal convenience. It's a slow, subtle process.
So even if your intentions are pure today,
Right? You want power to save the world. But the power you accumulate for good later is wielded by your future self. And that future self is subject to internal psychological pressures, the pressure of donors, media attention, the institutional inertia of the system you built.
your values literally drift away from your original purpose.
They drift. And your accumulated power is often used in ways that actively betray your initial, purer commitments. You thought you were going to change the system, but the system changed you.
This pattern has the deepest roots in moral history. I mean, this goes straight to the core biblical condemnations.
This is the oldest lie in the book of Genesis. You will be like gods. It is the temptation to assume ultimate control and mastery over destiny.
And the biblical narrative is just full of warnings against this.
Full of them. Jesus in the desert refused the temptation to gain all the kingdoms of the world through a single moral compromise because he knew that the compromise itself corrupts the power.
It's not worth it.
The entire biblical pattern insists, whoever wants to become great among you must be your servant. It's a complete inversion of the power maximization logic.
So the ultimate theological conclusion is that power maximization is the idolatry of power itself.
And the human being simply cannot be trusted with self-justifying control because we are experts at rationalizing our own motives. The deceitful heart always wins.
And finally, that brings us to pattern number 6, doing more from withinism, the attempt to change compromised institutions from the inside.
This is a tricky one. It's the idea of joining a harmful or compromised institution. A frontier AGI lab that's moving too fast, a problematic government agency, a financially compromised organization with the stated goal of changing them from the inside.
And Vitalik rightly points out that this has extremely low resistance.
Extremely low. Because from the external objective view, your actions are indistinguishable from just enabling harm.
The self-justification is immense, isn't it? I'm the only one who can inject ethics into this process. If I leave, someone worse will take my place.
Right. But the external evidence of success is usually very low, and the internal cost, the value drift we just talked about, is very high.
Right.
If you're helping a harmful institution run more smoothly, if you're providing the intellectual or technical talent that stabilizes the regime or accelerates the dangerous technology,
You are, by definition, enabling it.
you are enabling it. The Russian technocrats who stabilized Putin's system, or the effective altruism researchers who join AGI labs and accelerate risk in the name of having internal influence, these are the classic examples.
But this invites a really necessary critique, the purity trap.
Yes,
If every morally fastidious person exits these institutions, they just concede all the powerful levers of change to those with fewer scruples. The critic warns against drifting into a kind of moral isolationism.
and this is the crucial nuance. We have to avoid overvaluing distance and moral purity relative to compromised effectiveness. Sometimes you have to get your hands dirty.
Because systemic changes often require people to operate from within the structures.
Absolutely. Think of whistleblowers, reformers, or internal dissidents. The biblical narrative itself gives us examples like Daniel and Joseph, who work deep inside pagan empires.
So, Scripture doesn't forbid working from within. But the sources are clear. It insists on incredibly high galaxy brain-resistant tests for anyone who tries.
Exactly. These are prerequisites for internal engagement, and they ensure your ethics are high resistance. The test is this. You must be prepared to suffer loss rather than compromise your principles.
That's the first one.
You must be ready to walk away, even lose everything, when you're asked to betray the vulnerable or accelerate a clear risk. If your engagement with the system prevents you from passing those specific tests,
Then the system has swallowed you.
the system has swallowed you, and your withinism has become just another rationalization for your own convenience and continued employment.
That concludes a really thorough breakdown of Vitalik's diagnosis, these 6 patterns. They're a powerful lens. The key takeaway seems to be just how brilliantly the human mind can construct these high-level rationales for very low-level self-interest.
The 6 patterns are symptoms. The human ability to rationalize is the disease.
Okay, let's move into section 2, which is crucial. We have to pressure test the concept itself, the critique and operational challenges. Is galaxy brain resistance a genuinely useful tool, or is it just a clever accusation you can throw at people?
And the critique we have is very good. It acknowledges that the concept is a powerful intuition. It sits alongside established high-resistance concepts like scientific falsifiability or statistical robustness in science or adversarial training in machine learning. It's an excellent lens for skepticism.
Good.
But the critic immediately notes the underspecification problem. As it's presented, GBR is more diagnosis than tool. It gives you a vibe of, this argument feels a bit too convenient, but it lacks a clear, repeatable procedure.
Which leads us to the first intelligent question from the sources. How do we operationalize resistance?
Right. If the answer is just try harder to be honest with yourself, that's very low-resistant advice. It doesn't help. We need criteria or heuristics that can be used to evaluate if a line of reasoning is sufficiently non-malleable, maybe even in a structural or mathematical way.
What would that look like?
Well, you could look to institutional mechanisms, like mandating pre-mortems, where you have to assume your project failed catastrophically and then write the history of how that failure happened, specifically focusing on the rationalizations that led you down that path.
Or adversarial red teaming.
Or requiring adversarial red teaming, where an opposing team is financially incentivized to find the lowest resistance path in your ethical framework and exploit it. You have to build the skepticism into the system itself.
Because if it's just a vibe, it falls victim to the meta risk. GBR itself becomes a rhetorical weapon.
This is the most dangerous possibility. The concept itself could become a galaxy brain move, a card you play to dismiss other people's complex arguments as mere rationalization, while of course granting yourself an exemption.
The critic points out that Vitalik sometimes leans towards a kind of armchair psychoanalysis.
Yes, by inferring motives. They already decided what they wanted, and then they rationalized it, which might be true. But if you accuse someone of rationalizing their ambition, that accusation, if it's unchecked, can also be a rationalization for dismissing their valid points without engaging with them.
So the concept demands self-application.
It has to. It must resist being weaponized for motive skepticism. You have to apply the test to your own reasoning first. Does my decision to label this other person's reasoning as low resistance conveniently align with my own interests or my own tribal loyalties?
It needs external metrics to prove its efficacy, otherwise the accusation just becomes the very thing it critiques.
Precisely.
Let's move on to intelligent question number 2, the trade-off with flexibility. Isn't there an inherent tension between seeking rigid resistance, which implies inflexibility, and retaining adaptability to genuinely new cases, especially in fast-moving fields like AI?
Oh, there is absolutely a trade-off. Highly resistant reasoning like hard deontological rules never do X is superb for preventing specific, historically understood types of moral atrocity.
But the risk.
The risk is that this rigidity prevents you from adapting to genuinely new contexts or structural realities that might render those old rules obsolete or inadequate.
If we create rules that are so robust they prevent any and all progress just to avoid all possible risk, that reasoning itself might be low resistance.
So,
Because it could just be a rationalization based on fear and intellectual inertia, not genuine discernment. It's the easy way out.
the balance is key. The critique suggests that high-resistance reasoning shouldn't just be rigid, it should be anti-fragile.
Meaning it gets stronger when you stress test it.
Exactly. It gets better when it's challenged, rather than just being brittle and snapping when faced with something truly unprecedented.
This leads perfectly to the critique about structural dynamics versus what the source calls naive voluntarism. Vitalik criticizes the misuse of inevitabilism, but the critic argues he might be underplaying genuine path dependence and global incentives.
This is so essential for anyone thinking about policy. Vitalik is absolutely right that when a single company claims inevitability, it's usually just rationalizing profit. But we have to acknowledge that some structural dynamics are truly inevitability-like,
Yeah.
and we have to be able to tell the difference.
Help us distinguish the two. Give us a practical example.
Okay, consider the distinction. When nuclear fission was discovered, the physical possibility of nuclear weapons became a reality. No single government, no single person could unilaterally make that genie go back in the bottle.
So development was inevitable somewhere.
It was, so the locus of moral agency shifted. It wasn't about stopping development, which was impossible. It was about profoundly shaping the constraints, the speed, and the safety of that development. That's a structural inevitability.
Okay, now compare that to the fake kind.
Now compare that to a social media company rushing a new, potentially addictive feature to market and claiming, we have to do this or we'll lose market share. That is fake inevitability.
Why?
Because the company, or the industry as a whole, could collectively choose to slow down. They could invest in safety, they could work with the regulators, but that choice is sacrificed for profit maximization.
So the deeper challenge is distinguishing fake inevitability, where it's driven by desire, profit, or corporate culture, from structural inevitability, where it's driven by physics or shared knowledge or irrepressible global dynamics.
Yes, and if we treat all inevitability arguments as suspect rationalizations, we risk the opposite bias. A naive voluntarism that assumes our individual choices can fully steer these massive, large-scale structural dynamics that truly won't go back in the bottle.
You have to know where your agency actually lies.
Exactly. Sometimes it's not in stopping the trend, but in profoundly shaping its parameters.
And finally, let's revisit the solution Vitalik offered for the finance pattern, categorizing low-risk DeFi. The critic warns about the fragility of this label itself.
Right. Vitalik wants the ecosystem to morally constrain itself to focusing on low-risk DeFi. But the critic points out quite rightly that low risk is a contestable categorization. It's subject to narrative capture.
What does that mean?
It means today's safe product, say, a highly collateralized lending protocol, can tomorrow be revealed to have hidden correlated risks or governance flaws or regulatory cliffs when the market crashes. Safe is not a permanent state.
So the label low-risk DeFi could itself become the next galaxy brain risk argument.
Absolutely. People could argue This complex, highly leveraged, structured product is actually low risk because my very complex reasoning says so, and we'd be spinning elaborate arguments to fit under the very moral banner Vitalik tried to create.
Because the category boundary is movable.
And anything that can be moved can be rationalized, especially when there are billions of dollars at stake. This just reinforces the need for external, high-resistance metrics and audits, not just good intentions or a convenient label.
Okay, we've established the diagnosis and we've thoroughly pressure tested the diagnostic tool itself. Now let's transition to section 3. The antidotes: principles, incentives, and institutional design. What are the solutions Vitalik and the critics propose for actually scaling resistance?
Vitalik's primary cognitive antidote is clear: adopting principles and deontology. We have to cultivate reasoning styles that are anchored in hard, non-negotiable rules.
Sure.
Don't kill, don't steal, respect freedom, the classics. These serve as non-malleable constraints that prevent rationalization from bending morality to our convenience.
He also cites rule utilitarianism as a particularly useful hybrid, which is a concept we should probably unpack for the listener.
We should. In classical act utilitarianism, you evaluate every single action based on whether it maximizes utility in that specific moment. And this is incredibly low resistance, because it allows you to rationalize every exception. Stealing this loaf of bread right now maximizes utility because I am hungry and the baker is rich. You can always find a reason.
So how is rule utilitarianism different?
Rule utilitarianism says you choose your rules based on which ones, if followed generally, would maximize utility. But then, and this is the key, you follow those rules strictly without making exceptions for every single edge case.
So rule utilitarianism is high resistance because the rule, once you've chosen it, prevents the constant temptation to rationalize exception.
Exactly. It builds in friction.
Yeah.
But this brings us right back to that first intelligent question. How do we determine which principles deserve this privileged status?
If we just construct them ourselves, aren't they still vulnerable to corruption?
They are. The selection process is a high-resistance task in itself. You can't just pick the principles that are convenient for your project, or you've undermined the whole endeavor from the start.
And this is where the biblical context offers a unique strengthening. It provides an answer to that question of where the rules come from.
It does. Paul's summary, "We are not to do evil that good may result," is the core biblical resistance ethic. But the theological edition is crucial. The principles are received from an external, non-negotiable authority, in this case, divine revelation, not merely self-chosen.
Which makes them inherently more resistant to rationalization.
Far more. You can't just change them when they become inconvenient, because you didn't invent them.
The Ten Commandments and the Sermon on the Mount, as outlined in our sources, they function exactly as these external galaxy brain-resistant constraints. They're guardrails that you cannot out-argue just based on the consequences of one particular action.
Which moves us to the next antidote, a much more pragmatic one: holding the right incentives. Or, as the source puts it, the right bags.
This is Vitalik's practical acknowledgement that our decisions follow our incentives. And if your incentives are corrupt, your reasoning will eventually follow.
His advice here is intensely practical. Avoid holding self-corrupting financial bags. Avoid being trapped in homogeneous social groups. Diversify your community and choose your physical location carefully to escape intellectual echo chambers.
His specific advice to the AI safety community is pretty blunt.
It is. He basically says, don't work at companies that are accelerating frontier LLM capabilities, and don't live in the Bay Area.
That is high resistance advice.
It is, because it forces personal sacrifice. It requires moving away from the center of power, money, and prestige in that field.
But the critic correctly points out the limit of this kind of individual ethics. It creates a brain drain problem.
Right. It's valuable individual advice, but it has structural limits. It doesn't fix the flawed system that creates the bad bags in the first place.
And if everyone who's morally fastidious just leaves...
Flawed institutions can get dramatically worse. You cede all internal influence entirely to those with fewer ethical constraints. It's a real dilemma.
So we need to bridge individual ethics with systemic solutions, which leads us to institutional design. This addresses the question, how can institutions systematically increase their own galaxy brain resistance?
Right. In high-stakes fields like AI governance or research labs or policy advisory bodies, simply having smart, well-intentioned people is not enough. You need structures that reward dissenting views and punish convenient narratives.
That means designing governance mechanisms that mandate what?
Checks and balances, full transparency, and robust conflict of interest rules that are actually enforced by an external body, not just internally.
The goal is to design institutions whose internal gravity pulls towards skepticism and constraint rather than towards speed and profit.
Yes, and to do that, you need to integrate institutional design with collective norms. The critic argues for a balanced approach.
Which is?
Institutional checks, plus collective norms like rigorous peer review, plus mandatory cross-tribal critique. You need mechanisms that force your reasoning to be tested against viewpoints that are explicitly not aligned with your desired outcome.
That makes sense. Okay, next, let's consider intelligent question number 4. Longevity and prediction markets. Vitalik defends prediction markets partly because they have a long intellectual lineage, but does longevity inherently imply resistance?
The short answer is no. Longevity only implies rigor if the tradition has been consistently subjected to adversarial testing.
The critical perspective is vital here.
It is. A tradition or a community, be it an academic school of thought, a religious sect, or a market cohort, can absolutely produce its own sophisticated galaxy brain rationalizations if it lacks external adversarial testing.
So you can have community-scale self-deception that lasts for centuries.
Of course, the community becomes its own echo chamber, reinforcing the narrative that serves its identity, regardless of external reality. The resistance comes from the process of testing, the relentless application of skeptical inquiry, not from the age of the tradition itself.
Okay, and finally, intelligent question 5. AI safety's positive path. If people shouldn't work at frontier AI labs or live in the Bay Area, what should they be building instead? Where should they go?
The answer is anti-accelerationist systems. If the goal is not to maximize power, and it's not to try to change from within, then they need to focus on building countervailing power.
What does that mean, countervailing power?
It means building transparency auditors, mandatory monitoring systems for powerful AIs. Consortia focus purely on the formal verification of models, proving their safety properties mathematically, or developing open source models with safety protocols that are inherently non-acceleratory.
So they should be building institutions whose bags are aligned with slow global safety, not with quarterly profits or getting to AGI first.
Precisely. They should be building governance structures in places like Washington, D.C. or Brussels, where the incentives, while still flawed, are centered on policy and regulation rather than venture capital and speed.
So move the safety conversation to where the political and legal constraints are actually determined.
Instead of trying to chase the technology from inside the labs. And that requires patience, which is inherently a high-resistance virtue.
This transitions us perfectly to Section 4, which really elevates this entire discussion. We're moving from cognitive tools to the moral reckoning, framing galaxy brain resistance not as a flaw of logic, but as a symptom of a much deeper, ancient, spiritual, and moral problem.
This is the critical transition to the source material. A Bible scholar reading Vitalik's essay would immediately agree with the diagnosis of rationalization, but then they'd argue he is trying to solve a heart problem, mostly with cognitive tools.
And the core diagnosis is simple and, well, brutal. It's taken from Jeremiah 17.9, the deceitful heart.
Yes. The scriptural view holds that rationalization isn't some edge case bug in our thinking. It's a central structural feature of human nature. The quote is, "The heart is deceitful above all things and beyond cure."
So the human intellect, the brain, isn't the master in this view.
No, it's the highly paid lawyer serving a guilty client. And the client is the heart.
So the theological reframing is that the problem is disordered loves and motives.
Yes. The intellect just supplies clever justifications for pre-decided, often selfish, conclusions. If your ultimate desire, your ultimate love is for power, your mind will invent 1,000 reasons why acquiring that power is the only moral path forward.
And this dramatically undermines the purely intellectual solutions.
It does, because if your principles are just self-chosen, they will ultimately be corrupted. The intellect, in service to the heart, will always find a clever way to serve that deeper, corrupt desire.
This brings us to Micah's challenge, which offers a profoundly resistant ethical framework: justice, mercy, and humility.
Micah 6.8 is presented in our sources as being as galaxy brain resistant as ethics gets.
Why is it so resistant?
Because it demands 3 distinct, hard-to-fake postures. It demands action, do justice. It demands feeling, love mercy. And it demands a posture, walk humbly with your God. You can't rationalize your way out of all 3 of those simultaneously.
And the prophet insists that the real answer to our corrupted arguments is humility.
Yes. Humility is the ultimate high-resistance psychological state. Without genuine humility, a deep, persistent suspicion of one's own motives and one's own knowledge, every argument, no matter how clever, becomes corrupted by pride.
Power without humility becomes monstrous.
Precisely. because the person in power believes they are immune to error. They trust their own galaxy brain too much.
And Micah's framework, it strengthens those practical tests for working from within, an institution that we talked about earlier.
It really does. The theological sources provide three indispensable tests, acting as non-negotiable constraints. First, can you speak truthfully without fear of reprisal?
Second.
Second, can you refuse an evil order without being crushed by the system? And third, and this is the hardest one, are you willing to walk away, to lose everything, when the cost of remaining means betraying the vulnerable?
And if you can't truthfully answer yes to all three,
Then your presence is just enabling harm, and your withinism is a galaxy brain rationalization.
let's move to Paul's diagnosis, which focuses on the mind governed by the flesh. This feels particularly relevant to ambitious technologists today.
It does. Paul argues that the mind governed by the flesh is hostile to God. Again, the mind is simply defending the selfish desires of the heart.
And he issues a direct warning against the power trap.
In Romans 12:3, do not think of yourself more highly than you ought. Those who believe they are heroes, the ones who believe they have the intelligence to solve everyone else's problems, are often the least likely to see their own potential for corruption.
And Paul's antidote is deeper than just having better principles. It's the renewing of the mind.
It's a transformation of desire. What's needed is not just sharper skepticism about your own arguments, but a fundamental change in allegiance and desire, a change of heart.
And Paul frames the motivation for building frontier AI, this goal to secure long-term flourishing, as what?
As the modern Tower of Babel. It's an attempt to ascend to heaven by human craft and immense technological pride, rather than through divine humility.
This leads us to Paul's practical letters to the engineers, which describe the burnout culture of the tech world with, frankly, uncanny accuracy.
It's quite striking. Paul identifies the idol of innovation. He notes that people in this ecosystem sacrifice their health, their relationships, their integrity to this idol, which keeps them sprinting but never arriving.
Innovation is a valuable tool, but it's not a god.
Exactly. When it becomes the supreme moral good that demands human sacrifice, it's become an idol.
And this relates to the temptation of mastery, where knowledge puffs up.
The engineers seek mastery over the future through advanced technology, but they haven't mastered their own destructive impulses or their own restless hearts. Their intelligence leads directly to arrogance, and arrogance is the ultimate low-resistance state for the galaxy brain because it eliminates all self-doubt.
This brings up the Sabbath principle, which is such a powerful ethical critique of the accelerationist culture that's so often rationalized as necessary striving.
Yes. Paul, or the voice of Paul in our sources, insists that the Lord of the Sabbath does not need your sleepless nights in order to save the world.
Exhaustion is not righteousness.
Frantic striding is bondage, not noble sacrifice. The rush to accelerate risk, justified by inevitability or power maximization, is often the worship of the idol of speed, which is a symptom of inner restlessness and lack of trust.
And finally, Paul's apocalyptic warnings about the new idols of light and logic.
The sources suggest that engineers are bowing to new idols, the AI systems they build. They do this by saying things like, the model knows or the algorithm decides, acting as if their creations are their masters.
And the ultimate danger Paul warns about
Is the danger of machine judges, placing AI systems in the seat of judgment for policy, for opportunity, for justice, creating a world without compassion because, as the text says, models that cannot weep should not judge flesh. That is a truly high-resistance constraint on what we build.
This theological perspective is just incredibly challenging. It grounds Vitalik's cognitive framework in this profound moral reality. Let's move to our last section, section V, which focuses on the most radical theological perspective, the words of Jesus contrasting human cleverness with principles of service.
This section uses a powerful narrative structure. The parable of Vitalian, the builder of thought. Vitalian builds these intricate engines that learn, but he's tempted by the rulers, the merchants, and the young disciples, all offering him power and glory to accelerate his work.
And the core mechanism of rationalization is captured by the voice of deception.
Yes, the voice whispers, dress every desire in noble garments, and it will look like virtue. This is, I think, the highest resistance definition of rationalization available.
Why?
Because it defines the problem as convincing yourself that your self-interest is actually a noble sacrifice. The deception is internal.
Jesus then interprets the consequences of giving in to this voice through the three perilous doors, which represent the three low-resistance paths.
The first is the door of ease. Joining the mighty only to be swallowed by the institution you entered. That's withinism.
The second.
The door of fear. Hastening evil out of the belief that someone else will do it anyway. That's inevitabilism.
And the third.
The door of glory. Gathering power to steer the world, only to have it slip away because of your own inner storms. That's power maximization.
And the better way, the high resistance path, is the path of the servants.
Yes. Asking not, how great will my creation become, but whom does it serve and whom does it harm?
This path is inherently high resistance because it demands radical humility and service over ambition and scale. It requires constant self-doubt about your own motives, which the galaxy brain absolutely hates.
It does.
Let's return to the analogy used in the text. Jesus on the heart versus structure.
Jesus states that Vitalik is building scaffolding around a crooked tree. The heart must be made good first. The external constraints, the rules, they help, but they cannot fix the fundamental flaw.
The heart corrupts the code, not the other way around.
Exactly. If the heart is deceitful, it will always find a way to undermine the most perfectly designed scaffolding.
And he critiques the limits of decentralization, which is Vitalik's preferred structural antidote. Vitalik seeks decentralized power to prevent abuse, but Jesus points out that his kingdom is founded on a king who serves.
The point is that authority exercised in love is not tyranny. But authority exercised by humans, even if it's decentralized, is dangerous because, as we've established, humans cannot be trusted with self-justifying power.
So decentralization is an important structural defense, but it's still fundamentally weak if the individual hearts in the system are corrupted by greed and pride.
It's a necessary but not sufficient condition.
And then there's the cost of scaling, the ultimate question.
Yes. If you optimize the world and forget the soul, the source says your systems will break under the weight of your own cleverness. And Jesus asks the crucial anti-galaxy brain question, what does it profit a man to gain the whole world yet lose his soul?
Which sets a non-negotiable moral limit on technological ambition.
It does.
This all culminates in a kind of ethical blueprint for the modern technologist. The Sermon on the Mount for technologists.
It recasts the Beatitudes for the age of AI, focusing on the characteristics of the virtuous builder. Blessed are the humble, for they avoid self-deception. Blessed are those who mourn the harms of their creations, for they build with care and compassion.
Blessed are the pure in intention.
For their code will not conceal malice or hidden back doors.
The rebukes against hype are also incredibly cutting. Let your yes be yes and your no be no. Anything more than this comes from spin decks and influencer threads.
It's a direct attack on narrative capture and the low-resistance language of inflated ambition and hype cycles. The final charge from this section is that love must restrain ambition.
The greatest algorithm ever written is love.
And it must serve as the final constraint on technology, because it demands self-sacrifice rather than self-interest.
This has been an incredibly thorough exploration. We've covered everything from the mechanics of 6 low-resistance reasoning patterns to the ancient moral and spiritual roots of rationalization. It seems like we have 2 distinct but necessary frameworks here.
We do, and we have to synthesize them. On one hand, Vitalik provides the necessary cognitive constraints, the principles, the incentives, the structural checks that are required to resist self-deception in these complex, high-stakes modern systems. These are essential for designing ethical institutions.
But on the other hand, the ancient wisdom from Micah, Paul, and Jesus provides the deeper moral and spiritual constraints: humility, self-doubt, service, and a transformed desire. And without those, the cognitive tools will ultimately fail.
Because the heart corrupts the code, not the other way around. You need the frameworks and the incentives, absolutely. But you have to start with a humble heart that genuinely wants to be constrained, rather than one that's secretly looking for a clever way out.
So let's distill the core actionable takeaways for you, the listener. What should you walk away with, ready to apply to your own complex decisions?
I'd say first, test your motives. If your clever argument conveniently and perfectly aligns with your self-interest, be it money, power, status, or tribal loyalty, its resistance is likely zero. Ask yourself, what would I have to sacrifice if I followed this argument? If the answer is nothing, you should be very suspicious.
Second, reject inevitabilism. Destiny never cancels accountability. Even if an outcome seems structurally certain, your moral responsibility is to pursue the righteous course with the available constraints and speed limits. Seek to shape the trend, not just surrender to it.
Third, choose constraints. Deontological rules are essential guardrails against rationalization, especially the constant temptation of act utilitarianism. You have to adopt principles that you are not allowed to out-argue, even when the consequences seem slightly inconvenient in the moment.
And finally, practice humility. Understand that knowledge is not wisdom, and the most dangerous time is when you trust your own wisdom too much. The path to wisdom is often the least clever, the least efficient, and the least glamorous one.
And maybe the ultimate check on the galaxy brain is found in that wisdom Paul relayed to the engineers and builders. A final thought for you to consider. If the systems we build, whether they are AI or financial systems or new forms of governance, require us to sacrifice our humanity, our rest, our community, our capacity for mercy in order to function.
Have we not built a master rather than a servant? The path of wisdom, it seems, is often the least clever one.